Julian's palm was warm against the small of Vivian's back as he leaned into the microphone, his voice amplified to a smooth, wealthy purr that filled the glass-walled ballroom. He did not look at Clara, who stood in the shadow of the structural pillar, her fingers still stiff from the final pre-IPO tax audits she had completed in their kitchen at 4 that morning. Instead, he smiled at the 25-year-old assistant in the champagne silk dress, declaring to 80 venture capitalists that she was the true, solitary architect of Vanguard Ledger's success. It was a clean, public execution of 10 years of unrecognized labor, delivered with the polite efficiency of a corporate restructuring. Julian treated his wife's double shifts and silent accounting as nothing more than a minor historical footnote, an administrative resource that had finally run dry. The applause rose, loud and congratulatory, washing over the stage, while Clara remained standing in the dim light of the back gallery, her feet aching in her cheap shoes. The hum of the commercial cooling system in the penthouse suite of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a steady, low-frequency vibration that lived in the soles of Clara's feet. It had been running since 3 in the afternoon, trying to combat the heat generated by 150 bodies dressed in wool and silk. Clara stood near the long table of charcuterie, her hand wrapped around a glass of club soda that had lost its carbonation 20 minutes ago. The lime wedge at the bottom was pale and waterlogged, its rind starting to disintegrate. In the center of the room, under the recessed LED spotlights that cast a sharp white glow over the polished concrete floor, stood Julian. He was wearing the charcoal suit Clara had picked up from the dry cleaner at 7 this morning, before her shift at the clinic. He looked taller under the lights, his shoulders squared as he gestured with a half-empty glass of high-end whiskey. Next to him stood Vivian, her champagne-colored silk dress catching the light every time she shifted her weight. Julian was laughing, a loud, practiced sound that Clara had heard in their cramped apartment for 8 years before Vanguard Ledger became a name on the stock exchange. It was the laugh he used when he was winning an argument he had not actually prepared for. Clara took a small sip of the flat soda. The coldness of the water was the only sharp sensation in a room that felt entirely blurred. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache, a reminder of the 6 hours she had spent standing on the tiled floor of the municipal health department earlier that day, followed by the 2 hours she spent verifying the payroll ledgers for Vanguard's final pre-IPO filing. Julian did not look toward the charcuterie table. His gaze remained fixed on the group of venture capitalists from the firm that had provided their Series B funding. "This company is not just a platform," Julian was saying, his voice carrying easily over the soft jazz playing from the hidden ceiling speakers. "It is an ecosystem, and every ecosystem needs an engine." The venture capitalists nodded, their faces smooth and receptive. Julian reached out and placed a hand on Vivian's shoulder. The fabric of her dress puckered slightly under his palm. "I have to be honest with everyone here tonight," Julian continued, lowering his voice to a tone of mock humility that Clara recognized instantly. "While I might be the face of Vanguard, the real brain behind our recent pivot, the person who stayed up until 3 a.m. rewriting our market strategy before the final valuation, is sitting right next to me. Vivian has been the quiet force that made today's public offering possible. Without her, Vanguard would still be a set of spreadsheets in a basement. A light round of applause rippled through the circle. Vivian smiled, her head tilting slightly toward Julian's shoulder in a gesture that was practiced and perfectly timed. She did not look at Clara either, though Clara was standing less than 20 feet away, directly in her line of sight. Clara did not move. Her mind, trained by a decade of balancing 3 separate ledgers while working 40 hours a week at the registry, began to calculate. It took exactly $412 to pay the electric bill for the Vanguard office in its 2nd year. Clara had earned that money by taking 3 consecutive weekend shifts at the laundry depot, smelling of damp cotton and industrial bleach for 72 hours straight. The patent filing for the core data compression algorithm, the very intellectual property that Vanguard had just leveraged for its $80 million valuation, had been submitted under a joint partnership agreement that she had drafted herself using a legal template she bought for $49. She looked at the salt stain on the left heel of Julian's leather shoes. He had walked through a puddle of dirty slush on his way into the office yesterday, and she had forgotten to buff it out before they left the house. Julian turned slightly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, as if searching for something to validate his momentum. His gaze passed over Clara, paused for a fraction of a second, and then slid away. There was no hostility in his expression, only the blank neutrality of someone looking at a familiar piece of office furniture. He stepped back from the circle, guiding Vivian with him toward the bar. As he passed the corner of the charcuterie table, he stopped. Without breaking off his conversation with a senior developer from the engineering team, he reached out and set his empty whiskey glass down on the table, barely 3 inches from Clara's hand. "Clara," Julian said, his voice casual, almost administrative, "can you grab me another neat pour? And see if they have any of those smoked salmon tartlets left in the kitchen. Vivian hasn't eaten all evening." He did not wait for an answer. He turned his back to her, his hand returning to the small of Vivian's back as they moved toward the glass doors leading to the balcony. The empty glass sat between them on the dark wood surface. A single amber drop of whiskey clung to the bottom, slowly sliding toward the rim. Clara looked at the glass. She felt the weight of her old leather purse hanging from her shoulder, the strap digging into her collarbone through the thin fabric of her clearance rack dress. Inside the purse was her personal tablet, containing the active login credentials for the primary repository of Vanguard's core software library, a repository that still listed her personal email address as the primary administrative contact. She did not pick up the glass. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath, smelling the faint scent of caramelized onions from the catering trays and the heavy, expensive cologne Julian had started wearing 3 months ago. She turned her body slightly toward the exit, her flat shoes making no sound on the polished concrete. The descent from the 42nd floor of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a silent, pressurized drop that made Clara's ears pop 3 times. The interior of the elevator was lined with brushed brass and dark smoked mirrors, reflecting her image from multiple angles. In the dim lighting, the cheap fabric of her dark blue dress looked almost black. Her hair, held back by a plastic clip she had purchased in a pack of 5 from the drugstore, had begun to fray at the temples, tiny silver strands catching the weak light of the elevator ceiling. When the doors slid open into the subterranean parking garage, the air shifted instantly. The warm, jasmine-scented air conditioning of the penthouse was replaced by the cold, damp smell of concrete, grease, and stagnant water. Clara walked past the rows of gleaming luxury sedans and electric SUVs, her heels clicking a sharp, uneven rhythm against the oil-stained floor. Her car, a 10-year-old silver sedan with a dent in the passenger door from a hit-and-run 3 years ago, was parked in the furthest corner of Level 3, where the ceiling was low and pipes dripped a slow, steady lime-scale residue onto the asphalt. She reached her car and inserted the key into the driver's side door lock. The remote key fob had died in November, and she had decided that the $65 the dealership wanted for a replacement battery and reprogramming was better spent on the weekly grocery budget. She turned the key with a heavy twist, the mechanical lock clunking open with a dry metal screech. Inside, the car smelled of stale black coffee and the lavender air freshener that had lost its scent 2 winters ago. She sat behind the wheel, but she did not start the engine immediately. Instead, she slipped her feet out of her heels. The relief was immediate, but accompanied by a throbbing ache in her arches. She rubbed the red, indented line where the synthetic leather had dug into her skin. She reached into her purse and pulled out her tablet. The screen illuminated her face with a pale blue glow. The Vanguard administrative portal was still active. Clara logged in using her credentials. Her username was still listed simply as Admin1. She had created the system architecture on a folding table in their kitchen 5 years ago, while Julian was asleep in the next room after a 12-hour day of arguing with their first 3 beta testers. He had known nothing about the database structures or the hosting configurations. He had only known how to pitch the interface to people who had money. She tapped on the Billing tab. Under the payment methods, her personal credit card was still listed as the primary backup source for the server hosting fees. For 48 months, when the company account had run dry before the next small-scale funding round, the automated system had pulled directly from her savings to keep the servers online. The system had never been updated to remove her card, even after Vanguard received its initial $2 million seed investment. Clara clicked on the user management directory. Her eyes scanned down the list of administrators. Julian was listed as super admin. Vivian was listed as operations administrator, a change made 3 weeks ago without Clara's signature. Clara stared at the screen. The silent calculation in her mind was precise. The current market valuation of Vanguard stood at $84 million following today's opening bell. Julian's personal share was valued at roughly $42 million on paper, subject to a standard 6-month lockup period before he could liquidate any of it. But the intellectual property, the actual code that made the platform run, was registered under a holding company called Vanguard Assets, LLC. She closed the billing tab and opened her personal email. She pulled up the original incorporation documents for Vanguard Assets, LLC. In the early days, when Julian's credit score was too low to secure a simple business registration, Clara had signed as the sole managing member of the holding company. Julian was listed as an authorized agent. They had never updated the operating agreement. They had simply forgotten. A sudden vibration in her hand made her jump slightly. The screen of her phone, resting in the cup holder next to her, lit up. A text message from Julian. Clara, the message read, we are moving the after-party to the loft downtown. Need you to drive by the house and grab the spare set of keycards for the executive suite. They are in the top drawer of my desk. Drop them off with the security guard at the front desk of the loft by midnight. Also, did you call the cleaning crew for tomorrow? Clara stared at the glowing text. The time on her dashboard clock read 10:45 p.m. The drive from the hotel to their house was 30 minutes, and the loft downtown was another 20 minutes in the opposite direction. She did not reply. She placed her phone back in the cup holder, face down. The black glass of the screen reflected the dirty yellow light of the garage ceiling. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed, a rough mechanical rattle that vibrated through the steering wheel before settling into its familiar, noisy idle. The heater kicked on, blowing a stream of cold, dusty air onto her bare feet before it slowly began to warm. She backed the car out of the spot, the tires squealing slightly on the smooth concrete. She drove up the ramp, passing the sleek black town cars waiting for the VIP guests of the hotel, and turned onto the main road. The city lights blurred through the slightly greasy windshield. She did not head toward the highway that led to the downtown loft. She turned left toward the older, quieter residential district where their small two-bedroom house sat under the shadow of the water tower. Her mind was no longer tired. The fatigue that had weighed down her eyelids for the last 3 years had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She began to list the items she would need to organize before the sun came up. The first was the master domain registrar account. The second was the repository key. The driveway of the two-bedroom house was narrow, bordered on one side by a dry privet hedge that had grown unruly during the autumn. Clara parked the sedan, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden, heavy silence. The street lamp at the corner of the block cast a pale yellow light across the hood of her car, highlighting the thin film of road salt and grime that clung to the metal. She opened the car door. The cold night air hit her face, sharp and clean, a welcome contrast to the stagnant, expensive warmth of the hotel penthouse. She stepped onto the cracked asphalt of the driveway, her bare feet instantly freezing on the cold stones as she slipped back into her worn heels. She walked up the 3 concrete steps to the front door. The brass lock was stiff. It required a slight upward tug on the doorknob to align the bolt, a quirk of the old wooden frame that Julian had promised to fix 3 summers ago, before he became too busy to notice the house at all. Clara made the adjustment habitually, the key turning with a dull, familiar click. Inside, the house smelled of dry cedar and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla candle she had burned for an hour the previous evening to mask the odor of damp plaster from the hallway ceiling. The living room was dark, save for the green and blue lights of the internet router blinking in the corner like a miniature city at night. She walked to the entryway closet, opened the door, and hung her coat on the middle peg. The wooden peg wobbled slightly under the weight. Clara reached out and tightened the small screw behind the bracket with her fingernail, a routine task she had performed dozens of times. She did not turn on the overhead lights. She did not need to. She knew the layout of the house by heart, the exact number of steps from the door to the kitchen, the slight creak in the 3rd floorboard of the hallway that she always stepped over when she wanted to remain unheard. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was not a text message this time. It was a push notification from the financial app connected to their joint checking account. A charge of $342 had been authorized at the Velvet Room, a cocktail bar located 3 blocks from the downtown loft. The timestamp was 11:12 p.m. Clara stood in the dark hallway, looking at the glowing screen. The joint account was the same one they had opened when they were 22, when their combined net worth was less than $1,500. It was the account into which her biweekly paycheck from the Municipal Health Registry was automatically deposited. For the past 6 years, that steady deposit had been the anchor that kept their mortgage paid and their utilities active, while Julian poured every spare dollar of Vanguard's early revenue back into the development pipeline. Her mind began a rapid, silent calculation. Over the last 10 years, her salary had contributed approximately $212,000 to this house and their shared expenses. Julian's contributions during the first 7 years had totaled less than $30,000. Even after the Series A funding had allowed him to draw a nominal salary, he had routinely transferred large sums back out of the joint account to cover what he called temporary operating deficits. The $342 spent tonight was equivalent to 18 hours of her labor at the health registry before taxes. It had been spent on 3 rounds of premium gin and small plates of imported cheese, likely shared among 5 people who did not know her name. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. She walked down the short hallway to Julian's home office. The door was painted a dark charcoal gray, a color he had insisted on because he said it looked professional during video conferences with early-stage investors. She pushed the door open. The office was cold, the air tasting thin and unused. Unlike the rest of the house, which was furnished with hand-me-downs and pieces they had assembled themselves from flat boxes, this room was designed to impress. A large desk made of solid walnut sat in the center, flanked by an ergonomic chair that cost more than her first car. On the wall hung 3 framed prints of modern architectural designs, dry and sterile. She walked to the desk and pulled open the top drawer. The plastic keycards Julian had texted about were sitting in a neat stack next to a leather-bound notebook. They were sleek and black, stamped with the silver logo of the new luxury development downtown, where Vanguard had leased a hospitality suite for the post-IPO celebration. Clara picked up the cards. She turned them over in her hand, feeling the smooth, cold plastic. According to his text, she was supposed to drive these cards to the downtown loft before midnight so that the late-arriving guests could access the private elevators. She looked at the digital clock on Julian's desk. It was 11:22 p.m. She opened her left hand, letting the keycards slide from her palm into the deep recess of her own leather purse. She did not set them back on the desk. She did not leave them for him to find. She sat down in the expensive leather chair. The leather was stiff, smelling of new chemicals and wax. She pulled her tablet from her bag and set it on the walnut surface. In the quiet of the dark office, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room. Clara opened the browser on her tablet and navigated to the State Business Registry database. She logged in using the credentials she had kept stored in an old password manager account that Julian had never used. She searched for Vanguard Assets LLC. The listing appeared immediately, its status active and compliant. Clara scrolled down to the annual filing history. Under the section titled Authorized Officers and Members, there were two names: Clara Vance, managing member, holding 100% of the initial voting interest; Julian Vance, registered agent, holding 0 voting interest in the parent holding company itself, despite his 50% share in the operational subsidiary, Vanguard Ledger, Inc. She had drafted the articles of organization herself during their second year, when Julian was facing a potential personal bankruptcy lawsuit from an unpaid credit card debt. To protect the intellectual property of the software from his creditors, they had agreed to place the entire holding company in her name. They had never amended it. When the subsequent venture capital agreements were signed for Vanguard Ledger, Inc., the lawyers had focused entirely on the operational subsidiary, assuming the parent holding company's internal structure had been resolved by the founders. Clara clicked on the option to download the full certified corporate charter. The download began with a soft green progress bar. At exactly 1:24 in the morning, the yellow headlights of a rideshare vehicle swept across the kitchen wall, painting a brief, distorted lattice of window frame shadows across the plaster. The engine of the car idled in the quiet street for a few seconds before accelerating away with a low, wet hiss against the damp asphalt. Clara did not look out the window. She remained standing at the kitchen sink, her hands immersed in warm water. She was washing a single ceramic mug, running her thumb along the smooth, chipped rim in a slow, circular motion. The front door lock clicked, followed by the heavy, uncoordinated sound of Julian's shoulder leaning against the wood to force it open. He stumbled slightly as he stepped onto the linoleum of the entryway. The scent of cold air, damp wool, and the sharp, medicinal, sweet smell of high-end gin entered the house ahead of him. He walked down the short hallway, his leather-soled shoes loud on the pine floorboards. When he reached the kitchen doorway, he leaned against the frame, his tie pulled loose and his collar unbuttoned by 2 notches. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with the residual energy of the penthouse party, but his mouth was set in a tight, narrow line. "Clara," he said, his voice thick but sharp, "I texted you. I asked you to bring the keycards." Clara turned off the tap. The sudden silence in the kitchen made the hum of the refrigerator sound louder. She did not dry her hands immediately. She let the water drip from her fingertips back into the stainless steel basin. "I was tired," she said. Her voice was quiet, completely devoid of defensive modulation. She did not look at him. She reached for the cotton dish towel hanging from the oven handle and began to dry her hands, focusing on the skin between her knuckles. Julian let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like a cough. "Tired? Clara, we just went public. Do you have any idea what tonight was? The Series B guys were there. The underwriters were there. I had to stand in the lobby of the loft for 20 minutes waiting for the building manager because we didn't have the physical cards to access the private lounge. It looked completely amateur." He walked to the refrigerator, his movements slightly erratic, and pulled open the door. The harsh white light of the appliance illuminated the kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. He reached for a bottle of sparkling water, but his hand knocked against a glass jar of homemade pickles, sending it clinking against the wire shelf. He muttered a quiet, irritated oath under his breath. Luckily, Vivian had the digital backup credentials on her phone, Julian continued, unscrewing the cap of the water with a sharp twist. She managed to contact the regional security director and get us cleared within 5 minutes. If she hadn't been there to handle it, we would have been standing on the sidewalk like tourists. He took a long drink, his throat moving heavily. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes finally settling on Clara. "I don't get it," he said, his tone softening into that polite, disappointed cadence he used when he was giving performance reviews to junior developers. "I asked you to do one small thing tonight. You didn't have to stay at the party. You didn't even have to talk to anyone. Just a simple drop-off." Clara set the dish towel down on the laminate counter. She looked at him now. His hair was slightly disheveled, a single lock falling over his forehead. He looked like the man she had met in college, the one who used to share a single order of cheap noodles with her because they couldn't afford 2. But the eyes were different. They were the eyes of a man who had spent the last 3 years being told his ideas were revolutionary by people who wanted to trade on his equity. "I was tired," she repeated. Julian stared at her for a moment, his brow furrowing. He seemed to be waiting for an apology, or perhaps an explanation that he could easily dissect and dismiss. When she did not offer one, he shook his head, a gesture of quiet, patronizing resignation. "We need to get you some help," he said, setting the water bottle down on the counter with a soft clunk. "I know this scale of things is a lot for you. The stock market, the pressure, the pace. It is a different world. I get that. Tomorrow I'll have Vivian look into hiring a personal assistant for the house. Someone to handle the dry cleaning, the groceries, the scheduling. You shouldn't have to worry about these details anymore." The administrative assistant he was proposing would be paid out of their joint funds, a detail Julian had likely not considered. Clara's mind, operating with its usual quiet precision, did the math. A full-time household manager in their zip code cost approximately $55,000 a year. That was almost exactly the net profit from her salary at the health registry after taxes. He was offering to hire someone to replace her presence in the house, using the money she earned to pay for it, so that he would no longer have to ask her for favors. "That would be convenient," Clara said. Her tone was neutral, almost pleasant. Julian nodded, apparently satisfied that he had solved the problem with executive efficiency. He checked his watch, a heavy platinum piece that had been a gift to himself after the final SEC registration filing last month. "I have a breakfast meeting at 8 with the legal team," he said, moving toward the hallway. "We're finalizing the employee stock option distribution details. I'm going to sleep in the guest room so I don't wake you up when my alarm goes off." He paused at the edge of the kitchen, looking back at her. The light from the refrigerator was still illuminating the room. "Make sure you get some rest, Clara," he said. "You look exhausted." He turned and walked down the hall. A few moments later, the door to the guest room clicked shut, followed by the faint, metallic groan of the mattress springs as he lay down. Clara stood in the kitchen. She reached out and pushed the refrigerator door closed, plunging the room back into the quiet, green-tinted darkness of the street lamp's glow. She looked at her tablet, which was still resting on the counter where she had left it. The digital backup credentials Vivian had used to access the loft's private elevator were tied to the Vanguard Enterprise administrative system. Clara knew that system. She had set up the security groups herself. Vivian's access was routed through a third-party directory services API that Clara had registered under her own personal developer profile 5 years ago. She had 9 hours before Julian's legal meeting at 8 a.m. She pulled out her phone, opened the registry app, and looked at the primary configuration file for the API. It required a single, simple action, a rotation of the security keys. If she rotated the keys, every device using Vivian's administrative profile would be instantly locked out, requiring a manual physical verification that could only be approved by the master administrator. Clara's thumb hovered over the screen. She felt the cool laminate of the counter beneath her other hand. She did not rotate the keys yet. She put the phone back in her pocket, took her tablet, and walked quietly toward the main bedroom. There was still a great deal of documentation to organize before the offices opened in the morning. The gray, indistinct light of 5 in the morning began to bleed through the horizontal vinyl blinds of the bedroom, casting pale, parallel bars across the faded quilt. Clara lay on her back, her eyes open, watching the shadows of the dry privet branches sway slightly against the ceiling. She had slept for less than 3 hours, a shallow, dreamless sleep that left her joints stiff and her mind clear. She sat up, the old mattress springs making a soft, metallic groan that she caught by shifting her weight slowly. She slipped her feet into her fleece slippers and stood up. The house was cold, the morning air holding the damp chill of late autumn. Through the thin drywall, she could hear the rhythmic, heavy breathing of Julian snoring in the guest room down the hall. It was a familiar, grating sound that had once brought her a sense of comfort, a signal that the day's work was done. Now it was simply noise. Clara walked to the wooden wardrobe in the corner of the room. She opened the lower doors, reaching into the darkness to pull out a small, heavy cardboard box. Inside was a compact inkjet printer she had purchased second-hand 4 years ago to print invoice receipts for her health department audits. She set the printer on the small writing desk by the window and plugged the power cord into the wall outlet. The machine came to life with a loud mechanical grinding sound as the print carriage aligned itself. Clara paused, holding her breath, listening for any change in Julian's breathing down the hall. The snoring paused for a brief second, then resumed its heavy, even rhythm. She connected her tablet to the printer using a local network cable. She did not want to use the home's wireless network. Julian's phone was connected to the smart router, which logged every active device and data transfer on the local network. Her first task was physical preservation. In her experience at the municipal registry, she had seen dozens of digital records vanish during administrative transitions. Database entries could be modified, server logs could be wiped, and user accounts could be deactivated with a single keystroke. Paper, however, was stubborn. It required physical effort to destroy. She began selecting the files she had downloaded earlier. The original operating agreement for Vanguard Assets, LLC. The State Business Registry certification from 2018. The ledger sheets showing the $46,820 of her personal savings that had been transferred directly into the Vanguard operational account during its first 4 years of existence. The printer began to hum, a steady, warm sound that filled the small bedroom. The smell of hot plastic and ozone rose from the machine as the first sheet of paper slid into the plastic tray, the black ink still slightly damp to the touch. While the machine printed, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and picked up her phone. Her screen illuminated, displaying a notification from the shared digital calendar she had managed for Julian since they were married. At 8 a.m., the entry read, "Legal breakfast, Vanguard and L&M Partners." At 12:30 p.m., another entry appeared, "Lunch, Vivian at Le Petit Chateau." The lunch entry had a small, restricted note attached that had been synced from Vivian's administrative account. "Reserve corner booth, quiet. Confirm quarterly equity projection presentation is loaded on tablet." Clara looked at the entry. Le Petit Chateau was a French restaurant downtown where a simple lunch for two easily exceeded $300. It was a place Julian used to say was reserved for corrupt politicians and tech founders with more money than sense. Now it was on his weekly rotation. She opened her personal banking application. The joint checking account held $24,310. This was the money left over after their monthly mortgage payment had cleared last week, supplemented by her most recent bi-weekly paycheck from the registry. Clara's fingers hovered over the screen. Her internal calculation was precise. Under state law, either party listed on a joint checking account had the legal right to withdraw up to 100% of the funds without the other's consent, provided no formal separation or divorce proceedings had been filed. However, taking the entire amount would immediately trigger an automated, high-value transaction alert on Julian's phone, exposing her movements before she was ready. She entered the transfer amount, $12,155, exactly 50%. She directed the transfer to her private individual savings account at an online-only credit union she had opened 3 years ago, an account Julian did not know existed. It was a clean mathematical split. The remaining $12,155 would be more than enough to cover the automated utility bills and the mortgage auto draft scheduled for next Tuesday, ensuring that no alerts would be flagged for late payments. She tapped the transfer button. The screen displayed a small, spinning blue wheel for 3 seconds, then turned green. Transfer complete. Clara closed the application and set the phone face down on the nightstand. She felt nothing. No rush of adrenaline, no sudden panic. It was simply a line item being balanced. The printer stopped humming. The last sheet of paper slid into the tray with a soft click. Clara stood up and gathered the warm pages. She stacked them neatly, aligning the edges against the wooden surface of the desk. She placed the papers inside a plain manila folder, then slipped the folder into the center of her leather purse, beneath her personal ledger books. She unplugged the printer, wrapped the cord around the plastic casing, and returned it to the cardboard box in the bottom of the wardrobe. She closed the wooden doors and turned the brass key in the lock, placing the key in her pocket. The gray light in the room had turned to a pale, cold yellow. The clock on her nightstand read 6:15 a.m. She walked to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and waited for the water to run warm. It was time to begin her morning routine. She had a full shift at the health registry starting at 8, and she needed to be out of the house before Julian woke up to look for his key cards. The basement office of the Municipal Health Registry smelled of floor wax, damp cardboard, and the faint, sweet scent of vanilla-scented hand sanitizer that the receptionist used at the front desk. There were no floor-to-ceiling windows here, no glass-walled conference rooms, and no high-end espresso machines. The only light came from the long, humming fluorescent tubes suspended from the exposed concrete ceiling, casting a flat, grayish glare over the rows of olive-green steel filing cabinets. Clara stood in front of cabinet section 7, her fingers moving rhythmically through the paper tabs of the death certificates from 1998. Her physical routine was mindless but precise. Slide the folder forward, inspect the registration number, insert the new amendment form, and push the folder back. The heavy metal drawer made a sharp, screeching sound every time she pulled it out, a sound that had been the background track of her working life for 10 years. She picked up her ceramic mug and took a small sip of her tea. It was lukewarm, tasting of stale tap water and the metallic tang of the cheap tea bags she kept in her desk drawer. On the green vinyl blotter of her desk, her phone vibrated. It was 8:15 a.m. The legal breakfast meeting at L&M Partners had started 15 minutes ago. The phone screen lit up with a missed call from Julian. Clara did not pick it up. She watched the screen fade back to black. 3 minutes later, the phone vibrated again. Another missed call. Then came a text message. "Clara, where are the key cards?" Julian's message read. "They are not in the office. I checked the drawer. And the bank just sent me an automated balance alert. Why did you transfer $12,000 out of the joint checking account this morning? The bank's risk detection system just placed a temporary hold on my personal credit card because the average daily balance dropped below the preferred customer threshold. I am at the restaurant with the L&M partners, and my card was just declined for the breakfast tab. I had to ask the junior associate to cover it. This is embarrassing. Call me right now." Clara read the message. Her face remained completely smooth. Her mind immediately processed the calculation. The preferred customer status at their local bank required a minimum daily balance of $20,000 across all linked accounts. By transferring $12,155, she had dropped their balance to $12,155, instantly voiding the waiver. The automated fraud detection system, seeing a sudden high-value transfer, followed by an attempt to use the linked credit card at an upscale restaurant, had done exactly what it was programmed to do: lock the account until manual identity verification could be completed. Julian had no liquid personal accounts. His entire lifestyle for the last 6 months had been funded by the line of credit extended by the bank against his projected Vanguard equity, a line of credit that was legally tied to the health of his primary checking account. She reached for her phone and typed a reply. "Yes, I moved 50% of the savings to my personal account," she wrote. "We need to keep our personal assets separate for the upcoming tax filing. As for the key cards, they are in my purse. I must have slipped them in there last night when I was cleaning up the kitchen. I am currently at work and cannot leave my desk." She hit send. A minute passed. The heavy institutional clock on the wall above her desk ticked the black second hand jumping with a loud mechanical thud every 60 seconds. The reply came back almost immediately. "Tax filing is 5 months away, Clara," Julian wrote, the text blocks coming in rapid succession. "Why would you do this today of all days? And I need those key cards. Vivian is hosting the institutional investors at the suite at 10 a.m. She needs the cards to set up the presentation materials. This is ridiculous. Send an Uber to drop them off at L&M Partners. I will pay for the fare. Just get them here now." Clara looked at the message. She did not send an Uber. She did not call the bank to authorize the release of the hold on the joint account. Instead, she typed a brief, polite response. "I cannot use rideshare services during my shift," she wrote. "It is against departmental policy to handle personal business on state time. You can pick them up from the registry office during your lunch break if you need them. I will leave them with the front desk receptionist." She placed the phone face down on the green blotter. She picked up the next manila folder from the stack. The paper was dry and yellowed at the edges, representing the life and death of a man who had lived and died in this city 50 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a 5-digit registration number. She slid the folder into its alphabetical slot. Down the hall, the receptionist's phone began to ring, a distant, shrill sound. Clara knew it would be Julian, trying to bypass her personal line by calling the main registry office. She knew the receptionist, a woman named Martha who had worked there for 30 years, would tell him exactly what she told everyone who called during administrative hours, that Clara Vance was currently engaged in archival duties and could not be disturbed except for a documented family emergency. Julian would not call it an emergency. To do so would require him to explain to a state employee why his business was in jeopardy because his wife had his key cards in her purse. His pride would not allow it. Clara took another sip of her lukewarm tea. She estimated that the legal team at L&M Partners was currently explaining to Julian the details of the employee stock option pool, a pool that relied on the intellectual property owned by Vanguard Assets, LLC. She knew that by noon, when the automated database sync was scheduled to occur, the rotated API security keys would begin to cause the first minor errors in Vanguard's user access log. It would start as a slight delay in the login screen for the enterprise clients, a small circle spinning for 10 seconds instead of 2, a minor annoyance, easily dismissed as a temporary server spike. The first step was always invisible. At 11:45 a.m., Clara sat behind the heavy glass partition of the registry's public service counter. Martha, the primary receptionist, had gone to the staff break room for her lunch hour, leaving Clara to cover the visitor window. The lobby was mostly empty. A man in a faded denim jacket sat 3 rows back in the orange plastic chairs, staring blankly at a flyer about municipal property tax exemptions. The air in the room was warm and smelled of wet umbrellas and the burnt coffee from the automatic pot in the corner. Clara unpeeled the edges of the wax paper wrapping her lunch. She had brought a simple turkey and mustard sandwich on white bread, prepared at 6:30 this morning while the kitchen was still dark. The paper crinkled loudly in the quiet lobby, a sharp, paper-dry sound that seemed to hang in the air. The heavy glass doors of the building's main entrance slid open, and the sound of rapid, light footsteps echoed on the industrial linoleum. It was Vivian. She was wearing a cream-colored wool trench coat that looked completely pristine against the gray, water-stained walls of the public lobby. She carried a small, structured leather handbag with a gold clasp that Clara recognized from a luxury fashion catalog Julian had left on the coffee table last month. Vivian's hair was styled in the same sleek, low bun she had worn at the launch party, but there was a faint line of tension between her eyebrows, and her breathing was slightly shallow. She stopped in front of the customer service window, her eyes adjusting to the dim, institutional lighting of the office. When she saw Clara sitting behind the glass, she blinked, her polished, professional smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Clara," Vivian said, her voice muffled slightly by the circular metal speak-hole in the glass. "Julian said you would leave the key cards at the front desk. I had to park in the loading zone outside." Clara took a small bite of her sandwich. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and set the remaining half back down on the wax paper. Her hands were completely still. "I have them here," Clara said. Her voice was flat, carrying no anger, no sarcasm, and no curiosity. She did not reach for her purse immediately. Instead, she pulled a large, leather-bound visitor logbook toward her across the laminate desk. The paper was rough, the columns drawn in blue ink by hand. "I need you to sign the personal property release register," Clara said, sliding a black ballpoint pen through the narrow cutout at the bottom of the glass partition. Vivian looked at the pen, then at the thick logbook. She did not reach for the pen. "Clara, we are on a very tight schedule," Vivian said, her tone carrying a polite, hurried edge that sounded like a reprimand wrapped in a favor. "The Series B lead underwriters are already arriving at the downtown office. Julian's card is still having some sort of security issue, so I had to use my personal corporate card to pre-authorize the lunch catering. I really need to get those cards back to the suite so I can sync the presentation deck before 12:30. Can we skip the paperwork?" Clara did not move her hand from the logbook. "This is a municipal office, Vivian," Clara said, her tone remaining completely neutral. "Any personal items left on the premises that are retrieved by a third party must be documented with a physical signature and photo identification. It is standard county protocol." Vivian's jaw tightened. She looked at the man in the denim jacket, who was now watching them with mild interest, then back at Clara. She reached into her expensive bag, pulled out her driver's license, and slid it through the glass cutout, along with her signature on the paper. Clara picked up the license. She held it under the fluorescent light, her eyes moving deliberately from the photo to Vivian's face. She noted the name, Vivian Chen. The home address was listed in an upscale apartment complex 3 blocks from Vanguard's new headquarters, a building where the rent for a studio apartment exceeded Clara's monthly take-home pay from the registry. Clara began to write in the logbook, her pen scratching against the paper with agonizing slowness. She recorded the license number, the expiration date, the time of day, and the description of the items. 2 black plastic RFID access cards, property of Vanguard Ledger, Inc. While she wrote, she performed a silent calculation. The drive from the Vanguard office to the registry was exactly 24 minutes in midday traffic. The drive back would take at least 28 minutes due to construction on the bridge. Vivian had already spent 52 minutes of her morning on this errand, time she was supposed to spend verifying the secure API connections for the institutional investor portal. It was now 12 o'clock. At exactly 12 o'clock, the automated administrative audit Clara had scheduled last night would trigger. Because she had rotated the master API keys, the system would find a discrepancy between Vivian's local device profile and the core repository database. The system would not shut down. It would simply freeze any new data synchronization requests, displaying a generic connection error to any user attempting to upload new presentation decks or financial spreadsheets to the enterprise cloud. Vivian would not know why the deck was not syncing. She would assume it was a temporary network issue at the downtown office. She would spend her lunch hour trying to restart her tablet, completely unaware that the source of the lock was sitting behind a glass partition in a basement registry office. Clara finished writing, closed the logbook with a soft, heavy thud, and slid Vivian's driver's license back through the cutout. She reached into her purse, retrieved the 2 black keycards, and laid them on the counter. She pushed them under the glass partition. "Thank you," Clara said. Vivian grabbed the cards, her fingers brushing the cold plastic. She did not say thank you. She stuffed the cards into her bag, turned on her heel, and walked quickly toward the exit, her heels clicking a sharp, furious beat against the floor. The heavy glass doors slid open, letting in a draft of cold, wet air before closing with a soft sigh. Clara picked up the remaining half of her sandwich. She took a bite, looking out at the empty lobby. The clock on the wall read 12:02. The high, narrow window at the top of the archive room wall was thick with decades of grime, but it still allowed Clara to see the first heavy drops of autumn rain beginning to strike the concrete light well outside. The water ran down the glass in slow, dirty streaks, blurring the outline of the brick building across the alley. Inside the room, the temperature had dropped. Clara sat on a green metal folding chair, her wool cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. She took her reading glasses off, held them up to her mouth, and exhaled a soft, warm breath onto the left lens. She wiped the glass in slow, rhythmic circles with a small gray microfiber cloth, focusing on a microscopic smudge near the hinge. She repeated the process with the right lens, her movements precise and deliberate. When she put her glasses back on, she pulled her tablet from her leather purse. She did not connect to the building's wireless network. Instead, she enabled the mobile hotspot on her phone, creating a small, secure, encrypted tunnel that routed her traffic through a virtual private network. She opened the administrative console for the cloud infrastructure provider that hosted Vanguard's production database. The dashboard loaded with a clean, dark blue interface. In the top right corner, her profile icon was active, Root Admin. This was the master account, the one that had been created on their kitchen table 5 years ago, using her personal credit card for the initial $10 a month promotional tier. Julian had never asked for the login credentials. He had always preferred to access the system through his user-friendly executive dashboard, which was 3 layers removed from the actual server configuration. Clara clicked on the real-time activity log. The screen immediately began to fill with lines of bright red text, scrolling upward like a silent digital waterfall. Authentication failure. invalid API key. IP 192.168.10.45. Authentication failure. Invalid API key. IP 192.168.10.45. Authentication failure. Invalid API key. IP 192.168.10.45. The IP address belonged to the primary fiber line of the Vanguard Executive Suite downtown. The log showed that the system was receiving a synchronization request every 5 seconds. The presentation software on Vivian's tablet was trying to connect to the database to pull the live user engagement metrics for the Series B underwriters. Because Clara had rotated the master API security keys at 5:15 this morning, the presentation software was receiving a 403 forbidden error. The time on Clara's tablet read 1:38 p.m. The meeting had started 8 minutes ago. She switched to her administrative email inbox. There was a new automated notification from the server management system. Manual key override requested, the subject line read. Sender, j.vance@vanguardledger.com. Reason, critical system integration failure during partner presentation. Live database replication offline. Requesting immediate credential synchronization. Clara sat in the quiet of the archive room, the only sound the steady, rhythmic patter of the rain against the high window. She did not click the blue approve button. She did not click the red reject button either. If she rejected the request, the system would immediately notify Julian's technical lead that an administrator had actively denied the sync, exposing her involvement. If she did nothing, the request would simply remain in the queue, marked as pending administrator review. To Julian and his team, it would look like a standard database lockup, a common glitch that often occurred when a server was under heavy load during a high-profile launch. Her mind began to calculate the financial implications. The Series B underwriters from L&M Partners had valued Vanguard's live replication technology at approximately $12 million of the overall $90 million valuation. If the live replication failed during the demonstration, Julian would be forced to present static screenshots from last month's reports. To institutional investors, a technical failure during a live pitch was a significant red flag, suggesting that the platform's core architecture was not as robust or scalable as claimed. Every minute the server remained in a pending state, the pressure in that glass-walled conference room downtown would increase. Julian would be smiling, his voice remaining smooth and confident, as he told the investors that the IT team was running a routine security patch. Vivian would be tapping frantically on her tablet, her polished composure cracking as the connection wheel continued to spin, red and frozen. Clara's phone vibrated on the folding chair next to her. Julian's name appeared on the screen. She let it ring, watching the green bar slide across the display until it finally went silent. A moment later, a text message arrived. "Clara, are you there?" the message read. "The servers are acting up. The engineering team is saying there's an administrative lock on the master API. Did you change something when you did the pre-IPO ledger review yesterday? We are in the middle of the L&M pitch, and the live data is frozen. I need the master recovery password. Do you have it written down in the blue notebook at home? Clara typed her response with her left hand, her thumb moving slowly over the keyboard. I am currently in the basement archives, she wrote. The cell reception is very poor down here. I do not have access to any notebooks. I do not recall changing any settings during the ledger review. I am filing the 1998 records now and cannot leave my station until my shift ends at 6. She sent the message. She closed the tablet, slipped it back into her purse, and zipped the leather pocket closed. She stood up, her knees making a slight cracking sound in the cold room. She walked back to the row of filing cabinets, pulled open drawer number 8, and retrieved the next bundle of yellowed birth certificates. The paper felt dry and thin under her fingers, like old leaves. She began to sort them alphabetically, her movements steady, her mind completely quiet as the rain continued to fall outside, washing the dust from the window pane. The staff break room on the second floor of the municipal registry was a narrow, windowless space that smelled of stale microwave popcorn and the chemical pine cleaner used by the night janitor. In the corner, an old vending machine hummed with a low, erratic vibration, its fluorescent display glowing with a dull red light that read, "Exact change only." Clara stood at the small laminate sink, holding a yellow sponge that had lost most of its green scrubbing surface. She ran cold water over her plastic lunch container, washing away the thin smear of mustard and breadcrumbs from her noon meal. The water was cold enough to make her wrists ache, but she did not turn on the hot tap. She preferred the cold. It kept her awake. She shook the excess water from the plastic container and reached for the dispenser on the wall, pulling down a single sheet of scratchy brown paper towel. She dried the container with slow circular motions, her mind completely detached from the physical task. She pulled her phone from the pocket of her cardigan. There was a single notification. One new voicemail, received at 2:15 p.m. Clara held the phone to her ear, pressing the play button. She did not use the speakerphone. She did not want the sound to carry into the quiet hallway where Martha was currently filing health permits. Julian's voice was thin, filtered through the cheap microphone of his phone and the background roar of city traffic. "Clara," he said, his tone carrying a sharp, breathless edge that he was trying to suppress. "I do not know what is going on. The underwriters at L&M are putting the contract signing on hold. Their technical liaison is calling it a critical architectural instability. They want a full security audit of our repository before they finalize the valuation. And Vivian's card is blocked now, too, because of the pending charges from the hotel. I need you to go down to the bank branch on 4th Street. You know the manager, Mr. Henderson. Tell him there has been a mistake. Tell him to release the holding block on the joint account immediately. I cannot leave the downtown office. The investors are still in the conference room, and I have to keep them calm. Please, Clara, just handle this." The voicemail ended with a sharp click, followed by the automated voice of the registry system stating the time of the message. Clara deleted the message. She folded the brown paper towel and wiped a small puddle of water from the edge of the sink, leaving the laminate surface completely dry. Her internal calculation was immediate and precise. The joint account was currently frozen because Julian had attempted to run high-value transactions while the average balance was below the required limit. Mr. Henderson, the branch manager, was a conservative man in his 60s who had authorized their first small personal loan 5 years ago. He knew Clara as the reliable, detail-oriented partner who kept the ledger books in perfect order. If she went to the bank, she could easily resolve the block. She had no intention of doing so. If the joint account remained frozen until tomorrow morning, Julian's personal credit cards would remain inactive. He would be unable to pay the hosting fees for Vanguard's development servers when the monthly billing cycle renewed tonight at midnight. The automated system would attempt to bill the joint account, fail, and then attempt to bill her backup card. But Clara had already deactivated her personal credit card as the backup source on the AWS billing portal at 5:30 this morning. When the billing failed tonight, the cloud provider would send a standard 12-hour grace period warning. If the payment was not cleared by noon tomorrow, the development servers would automatically transition to read-only status, freezing any new code commits from Julian's engineering team. She walked out of the break room, down the quiet hallway, and sat back down at her desk. She pulled her tablet from her bag and opened her personal web browser. She navigated to her private credit union account. The balance stood at $12,155. She looked at her saved bookmarks and selected the contact page for Albright & Finch, LLP, a boutique legal firm that specialized in intellectual property and corporate disputes. She had researched their senior partner, a woman named Eleanor Finch, who had a reputation for handling complex equity divisions with extreme, quiet efficiency. The retainer fee for a standard initial representation and file audit was $10,000. Clara clicked the click-to-call link on her screen. The phone rang twice before a receptionist with a calm, professional voice answered. "Albright & Finch, how may I help you?" "My name is Clara Vance," Clara said. Her voice was steady, her tone matching the receptionist's professional flat cadence. "I would like to schedule an urgent consultation with Eleanor Finch regarding a corporate asset and intellectual property division. I have the certified corporate charter for the holding company and the original partnership agreements ready for review." "Let me check Ms. Finch's calendar," the receptionist said. "I have an opening tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. Would that work for you?" "Yes," Clara said, "that will be fine. I will send you the intake forms and our secure payment link for the $10,000 retainer," the receptionist said. "Once the payment is processed, your appointment will be confirmed." "Thank you," Clara said. She hung up the phone. Within 30 seconds, an email arrived with the secure payment link. Clara entered her private savings account details and authorized the transfer of $10,000. The screen displayed a confirmation message, leaving her with exactly $2,155 in her personal reserve. It was more than enough to cover her food and fuel for the next month. She closed the browser, put the tablet back in her purse, and pulled the stack of 1998 certificates toward her. The rain outside was heavier now, the water hitting the high window in a steady drumming beat that drowned out the hum of the fluorescent lights. She began to file the next record, her fingers moving with the same mechanical rhythm she had used all morning. She was no longer waiting for the clock to hit 6. She had already moved past the waiting phase. The drive home from the municipal registry took 35 minutes, the windshield wipers of Clara's sedan making a dry, rhythmic scraping sound against the glass as they struggled with the greasy road film and the heavy evening rain. By the time she pulled into the narrow driveway The street lamps had flickered on, casting long, shivering reflections across the wet asphalt. The house was completely dark. Clara unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and hung her wet coat on the wobbly wooden peg in the entryway closet. She slipped off her wet shoes, leaving them on the rubber mat to dry. The air in the hallway felt heavy and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of the baseboard heaters that had not yet kicked on. She walked into the kitchen and did not turn on the main overhead light. Instead, she flipped the switch for the small fluorescent tube beneath the range hood, illuminating the laminate countertops with a pale, narrow beam. Julian's presence from his morning rush was still visible, preserved like an exhibit in a museum of domestic neglect. On the kitchen island sat his half-eaten slice of morning toast, now curled and hard as stone at the edges, resting on a paper napkin. Next to it was an unwashed ceramic mug with a dark ring of dried coffee at the bottom and a crumpled receipt from a downtown pastry shop dated 7:45 a.m. On the back of the chair hung his discarded gray tie, crumpled and smelling faintly of yesterday's wool. Clara stood by the island, looking at the dried toast. Her mind began its quiet, mechanical calculation. The cloud database subscription for Vanguard was set to renew at precisely midnight tonight. The monthly premium for their enterprise tier database clustering was $8,400. Because Julian's primary corporate credit card was still under a fraud hold due to the drop in the joint checking accounts balance, the automated transaction would fail. The system would then attempt to charge the backup payment method on file. Up until 5:30 this morning, that backup method had been her personal credit card. Now the system would find no backup card. At exactly 12:30 a.m., an automated payment failure notification would be dispatched to Julian's primary inbox and to Vivian's operations directory. Julian would likely be asleep, or perhaps still out with the underwriters trying to salvage the Series B valuation. Vivian would not see the notification until she opened her laptop at her desk tomorrow morning. By then, 6 hours of the 12-hour grace period would have already elapsed. Clara reached out, picked up the dried piece of toast, and dropped it into the small plastic trash bin beneath the sink. She took his dirty coffee mug, placed it in the sink, and ran warm water into it, watching the dark brown residue dissolve and swirl down the drain. She wiped the counter with a clean sponge, erasing the ring of grease left by the pastry receipt. She did not feel angry. The domestic cleanup was no longer an act of service. It was simply the clearing of a workspace. She took a small aluminum pot from the cabinet, filled it with a single cup of canned tomato soup, and set it on the gas stove. She turned the dial, the burner igniting with a sharp blue hiss that filled the quiet room with the scent of hot metal and gas. While the soup heated, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her tablet resting open next to her bowl. An email from Albright & Finch had arrived in her inbox. "Dear Mrs. Vance," the message read, "your intake documentation has been reviewed and the retainer payment of $10,000 has been successfully processed. Your consultation with Eleanor Finch is confirmed for tomorrow morning, Wednesday, at 8:30 a.m. at our downtown office. Please bring physical copies of all original incorporation filings, partnership agreements, and any financial records documenting personal capital contributions to Vanguard Assets, LLC. Clara clicked the reply button. "Thank you," she wrote. "I have all the physical documentation organized in a file and will arrive 10 minutes prior to the scheduled time." She sent the message. She stood up, turned off the burner, and poured the steaming red soup into a plain white ceramic bowl. She sat back down and ate her dinner in absolute silence, listening to the heavy rain tap against the window pane behind her. She looked across the dark living room toward the fireplace mantel, where a framed photo from their wedding 10 years ago sat in the shadow of a dry ivy plant. In the photo, Julian was wearing a rented tuxedo that was slightly too large in the shoulders, his face bright with a youthful, unpolished ambition. She was wearing a simple lace dress she had bought off the rack, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. She tried to remember the feeling of that day, the sense of shared purpose that had made her agree to work 2 jobs so he could spend 16 hours a day coding a system he barely understood. The memory felt thin, like a page of a book she had read a long time ago in a language she no longer spoke. She finished her soup, washed the bowl and the pot, and left them to dry on the rack next to Julian's coffee mug. She checked her watch. It was 7:40 p.m. She walked down the hall to the main bedroom, closed the door behind her, and sat at her small writing desk. She pulled the manila folder from her purse and began to sort the printed corporate filings one last time, checking each signature, each date, each notary seal. The structure was complete. Every line was balanced. She turned off the desk lamp, undressed in the dark, and climbed into bed. The sheets were cold, but she fell asleep almost instantly, her breathing deep and even, undisturbed by the storm that continued to rage against the side of the old house. The kitchen clock read 7:15 a.m. when Clara walked down the hallway. The house was no longer silent. The sharp, acidic smell of cheap burnt coffee filled the air, indicating Julian had been awake for some time. From the kitchen, the high-pitched, frantic whine of his laptop fan cut through the morning quiet, struggling under the strain of multiple open database connections. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island, still wearing the wrinkled gray trousers from yesterday and a thin white undershirt. His hair was wild, sticking up in disheveled tufts at the back, and his eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark purple hollows. He was typing with an aggressive, heavy-handed rhythm, his fingers slapping the keys with unnecessary force. Clara stopped in front of the hallway mirror. Her physical routine was calm and deliberate. She pulled her charcoal wool coat over her shoulders, aligning the seams. She buttoned it from the bottom to the top, ensuring each plastic disc was secured in its designated loop. Then she wrapped her dark green wool scarf around her neck, tucking the loose ends neatly beneath the lapels of her coat. Julian did not look up from his screen, but his voice broke the silence, sharp and erratic. "Clara, did you see the alerts?" he asked, his hands never leaving the keyboard. "The cloud servers failed their billing run at midnight." "I didn't see the email until 6 a.m. It's a mess. The technical lead is panicking because we have the follow-up meeting with L&M at 2 p.m., and the whole development pipeline is locked in read-only mode because of the payment failure. Why haven't you called the bank?" Clara adjusted her scarf, ensuring it was centered. "I was sleeping," she said. Her voice was quiet, lacking any defensive edge. Julian finally stopped typing. He looked up, his face tight with frustration. "Sleeping? Clara, the servers are down. Vivian is at the office right now. trying to put her corporate card in as the primary payment method, but the system is rejecting it because the account billing name doesn't match the parent holding company registration. I tried to call the bank manager, but Mr. Henderson isn't in his office until 9 a.m. I need you to go down there the minute they open. You're the only one who can sign off on the asset verification so they can lift the fraud hold. Clara picked up her black leather purse from the entryway table. The physical weight of the manila folder inside was a solid, comforting presence against her side. "I cannot go to the bank this morning," she said. "I have an appointment." Julian stared at her, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. An appointment? What could possibly be more important than this? Vanguard is about to lose its Series B lead underwriters if we can't show them the live database sync at 2 o'clock. Whatever your appointment is, reschedule it. Just tell them it's an emergency. "I cannot reschedule," Clara said. She did not offer an explanation. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him, her expression as smooth and unreadable as the glass of the hallway mirror. Her internal calculation was running in the background. It was currently 7:25 a.m. The cloud provider's 12-hour grace period would expire at exactly noon. Even if Julian reached Mr. Henderson at 9 o'clock, the bank's manual compliance division required a minimum of 3 to 4 hours to clear a security hold on a shared business asset once a fraud flag had been raised. The timeline was already too tight. The shutdown of the development environment was mathematically guaranteed to happen before the 2 p.m. meeting. Julian let out a loud, stressed breath and threw his hands up in the air. "I don't understand you lately," he said, his voice dropping into that patronizing, disappointed tone. "It's like you don't even care about what we've built here." "I am trying to secure our future, Clara. Vivian is working herself to the bone to save this deal, and you won't even take 30 minutes to go to the bank?" Clara opened the front door. The cold, damp air of the morning rushed into the warm hallway, carrying the smell of wet pavement and dry pine needles. "I have to leave now," she said. "I will be at work after my appointment." She stepped out onto the concrete porch and closed the heavy wooden door behind her. The brass deadbolt clicked into place with a solid, final sound. The drive to the financial district took 20 minutes. Clara parked her car in a multi-story public garage 2 blocks from the glass tower that housed the offices of Albright and Finch, LLP. She walked through the damp streets, her flat shoes making a soft, wet sound on the sidewalk. Unlike the municipal registry, this part of the city was filled with tall, clean structures of steel and polished granite. Men and women in tailored suits moved past her, their faces focused on their phones, their movements hurried and precise. She entered the lobby of the tower. The air was warm, smelling of expensive white tea and floor polish. A security guard in a crisp black uniform directed her to the 28th floor. The elevator ride was silent and fast. When the doors slid open on the 28th floor, Clara stepped onto a thick, cream-colored carpet that muffled the sound of her footsteps entirely. The reception area of Albright and Finch was lined with dark walnut paneling and soft leather chairs. Large windows looked out over the gray, rain-slicked harbor in the distance. The receptionist looked up from her desk, her smile polite and professional. "Good morning. Are you Clara Vance?" "Yes," Clara said. "I have an 8:30 appointment with Eleanor Finch." "Of course," the receptionist said. "Miss Finch is expecting you. Please follow me." Clara followed her down a quiet corridor lined with closed doors of frosted glass. In the distance, she could hear the quiet, rhythmic clicking of a high-end printer, a soft, expensive sound that was very different from the screeching filing cabinet drawers of her own office. The receptionist opened a door at the end of the hall, revealing a spacious corner office. Eleanor Finch was sitting behind a large mahogany desk. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, graying hair cut into a precise bob and keen, intelligent eyes behind a pair of thin, tortoiseshell glasses. She wore a dark blue, structured blazer that looked like it had been tailored specifically for her. When Clara entered, Eleanor stood up and extended her hand. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice low, calm, and steady. "Thank you for coming in so early. Please take a seat." Clara took her coat off, draped it neatly over the back of the leather chair opposite the desk, and sat down. She reached into her purse, pulled out the manila folder, and set it on the polished mahogany surface. "Let's begin," Clara said. The corner office of Eleanor Finch was remarkably quiet, the heavy glass windows sealing out the roar of the city traffic 28 stories below. The only sound was the dry, rhythmic rustle of paper as Eleanor turned the pages of the manila folder Clara had placed on her desk. Clara sat perfectly still in her leather chair. Her physical routine was methodical. She reached into her purse, pulled out a small black pen, and laid it exactly parallel to the edge of Eleanor's leather desk blotter. Then, one by one, she slid the secondary documents across the mahogany surface. The bank statements from the first 3 years of Vanguard, the personal tax returns showing her dual income filings, and the original notched brass key to their first physical storage locker where the early server towers had been housed. Eleanor adjusted her tortoiseshell reading glasses, her eyes scanning the lines of the Vanguard Assets LLC operating agreement from 2018. A quiet double knock sounded at the door. An assistant entered silently, holding a dark wooden tray with a white porcelain teapot, 2 matching cups, and a small plate of dry shortbread biscuits. The assistant set the tray on a low side table, offered a brief, polite nod, and withdrew without a word. The steam rose from the spout of the teapot in a thin, twisting line, carrying the faint, clean scent of black tea into the room. Neither Clara nor Eleanor reached for a cup. The tea sat untouched, slowly cooling in the quiet office. "This is a remarkably clean structure," Eleanor said, her voice low and even as she turned to the 3rd page of the charter. "Most founders who build their platforms in basements leave a trail of messy oral agreements or half-drafted emails. But you drafted this as a sole-member limited liability company." Clara kept her hands folded in her lap. "We had to," she said. "Julian was facing a collection suit from an old credit card debt when we registered the domain. If we had put his name on the holding company, the creditor would have attached a lien to the patent applications before we could even pitch to our first angel investor. We agreed to keep the intellectual property entirely in my name through the LLC and license the technology to the operating entity, Vanguard Ledger, Inc., on a royalty-free basis." Eleanor nodded, her finger tracing a clause on the document. And according to Section 4 of this license agreement, the royalty-free terms are contingent upon the operating entity maintaining its status as a private, closely held corporation. It states here that upon any public offering, merger, or transition to a publicly traded entity, the operating agreement must be renegotiated within 90 days, or the license automatically defaults to a standard commercial rate of 12% of gross revenue, retroactively applied to the date of transition. "That is correct," Clara said. Her mind began a rapid internal calculation. Vanguard Ledger, Inc. had gone public yesterday morning. The gross revenue projected for their current fiscal year was $14 million, primarily driven by the enterprise database subscriptions that were currently locked in read-only mode due to the hosting billing failure. A 12% retroactive royalty on gross revenue would amount to $1,680,000. But the operating entity did not have that kind of cash liquidity. Julian had emptied their reserve accounts to fund the public launch campaign and the penthouse celebration. If the holding company demanded immediate payment of the retroactive royalty, Vanguard Ledger, Inc. would be forced to disclose the intellectual property dispute to the Securities and Exchange Commission in an emergency filing. Under federal securities laws, a publicly traded company that does not legally own its core technology must halt trading immediately. Julian's paper wealth, his $42 million in stock, would be frozen behind the 6-month lockup period. He would be unable to sell a single share to pay the holding company's demands. The stock price would plummet to zero before he could touch a dime of it. Eleanor took her glasses off, letting them hang from a thin silver chain around her neck. She leaned back in her chair, looking at Clara with a calm, clinical curiosity. "You realize what this will do to the operating company," Eleanor said. "It is not just a financial penalty. If we file a formal cease and desist under the holding company's authority, we can legally freeze their database access entirely until the royalty is paid or the license is renegotiated. Vanguard Ledger, Inc. will have to stop services for all 84 of their enterprise clients." "I am aware," Clara said. "And you are prepared to proceed with the filing?" "Yes," Clara said. Eleanor picked up her pen, tapping it twice against her blotter. "Julian Vance will attempt to claim that there was an implied partnership agreement," she said, her tone professional and objective. "He will argue that the holding company structure was a temporary asset protection measure and that the true intent was 50-50 ownership of all assets, including the IP." "He can argue that," Clara said softly. "But we have 6 years of tax returns where he filed as a standard employee of the operating subsidiary, drawing a nominal salary, while I filed as the sole managing member of Vanguard Assets, LLC, paying the corporate registration fees and the federal taxes on the holding company's assets from my own personal checking account." He never challenged the structure when the venture capitalists were auditing the books, because he didn't want his personal credit history to interfere with the funding rounds. He chose the convenience of having me carry the liability. Eleanor smiled, a brief, sharp movement of her mouth that carried no warmth. He wanted the status of a founder without the administrative burden of protecting the assets, she said. It is a common pattern among technical executives. They view the legal framework as background noise until the structure begins to lean. She pulled a fresh pad of yellow legal paper toward her and began to write, her pen making a dry, scratching sound in the quiet room. I will draft the formal default notice and the demand for retroactive royalty payments today, Eleanor said. We will deliver it to Vanguard Ledger's registered corporate agent tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Since you are the sole member of Vanguard Assets, LLC, you do not need Julian's signature to authorize the action. We will also prepare a motion for a temporary restraining order to prevent them from using the database compression algorithm in their live production environment until the default is cured. How long will the court take to issue the restraining order? Clara asked. Given the documentation you have provided, Eleanor said, looking up from her pad, we can secure an emergency hearing within 48 hours. By Friday morning, Vanguard Ledger Inc. will have to shut down its servers or face federal contempt charges. Clara stood up. She picked up her coat, draped it over her arm, and slipped her pen back into her purse. That is acceptable, Clara said. Thank you for your time, Miss Finch. Eleanor stood as well, extending her hand once more. I will have my office send you the draft of the filing by 5 o'clock this evening for your final approval, Mrs. Vance. Get some rest. The next few days will be very noisy for your husband. Clara nodded, her expression remaining perfectly calm. He is used to noise, she said. She turned and walked out of the office, her flat shoes making no sound on the thick cream carpet of the corridor. As she stepped into the elevator, she looked at her watch. It was 9:25 a.m. The cloud servers had less than 2 hours of their grace period remaining. At 11:30 a.m., Clara stood near the water cooler in the hallway outside the basement archive room. On the beige plaster wall next to the thermostat hung an old, heavy metal hand-crank pencil sharpener, its green enamel paint chipped away around the mounting screws. Clara inserted a standard yellow wooden pencil into the multi-size dial, selecting the correct diameter with a soft plastic click. She grasped the cold steel handle and began to turn it. The grinding rasp of the internal cutting blades vibrated through her wrist, a rhythmic mechanical crunch that filled the quiet corridor. She turned the crank exactly 6 times, paused, and pulled the pencil out. She inspected the tip under the harsh light of the ceiling fixture, blew away a tiny speck of fine gray graphite dust from the cedar wood, and stepped back to her desk. It was 11:42 a.m. The black phone on her desk, a heavy analog unit with a dusty plastic coil cord, let out a sharp double ring. It was the direct line from the building's front desk. Clara picked up the receiver, pressing it to her ear. Health Registry, Clara speaking. Clara, it's Julian. His voice came through the line. The connection was clear, but his breathing was shallow, rapid, and dry. He was speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper, as if he were hiding in a closet or a quiet corner of his office. I am at the 4th Street Bank branch. I've been sitting in Mr. Henderson's office for 45 minutes. Clara laid the sharpened pencil down on her desk, aligning it parallel to her keyboard. I see, she said. Henderson says he can't lift the fraud block on the joint account Julian continued, his voice rising slightly in pitch before he caught himself and lowered it again. He says because the transfer was flagged as an unusual transaction on a joint asset with shared liabilities. He needs a physical signature from you to authorize the release. He won't take my signature alone because the account was originally registered under your credit profile when we set up the mortgage. Julian paused, waiting for a response. When Clara remained silent, he let out a short, desperate sound. "Clara, please!" The AWS grace period ends at noon. That is 18 minutes from now. If the servers go read-only, the database sync will fail when L&M runs their diagnostic test at 2. The lead underwriter told me this morning that if the live replication is offline, they will have to postpone the entire valuation audit until next quarter. We can't survive next quarter without the Series B cash. I am begging you, just walk over here. It's only 10 minutes from your building. Clara looked at the wall clock. The black second hand was jumping from tick to tick with a soft, rhythmic thud. She performed a silent, cold calculation. The 4th Street Bank branch was indeed a 10-minute walk from her office, but she would have to fill out the security log at her building's exit, walk through the heavy rain, wait for the bank's administrative desk to process her driver's license, sign the physical affidavit, and wait for Mr. Henderson to manually upload the document to the regional compliance system. Once uploaded, the bank's batch system would require at least 45 minutes to clear the automated hold on the linked corporate card. By the time the card was active and the cloud provider's automated system reattempted the $8,400 transaction, it would be well past 1 o'clock. The server transition to read-only was already a mathematical certainty. Her leaving her desk would change nothing but her own dry clothes. I am currently compiling the 1998 county health statistics for the state auditor's noon deadline, Julian, Clara said. Her voice was level, polite, and entirely devoid of emotion. I cannot leave the building. My supervisor has already logged my morning absence for my personal appointment. If I leave again, it will be marked as an unexcused shift abandonment. An unexcused shift? Julian's voice cracked, the whisper vanishing, replaced by a raw, incredulous anger. Clara, are you insane? We are talking about a $90 million company. Your job pays you $40,000 a year. I will write you a check for $40,000 right now. I will pay your salary for the next 10 years. Just walk out the door. My position at the registry is stable, Julian, Clara said, her tone remaining completely unchanged. It has municipal retirement benefits and health coverage. I have to prioritize my long-term security. Our entire wealth is tied up in Vanguard, Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. If Vanguard fails, we have nothing. The house, the stock, everything. Don't you understand that? You are destroying our future over a bureaucratic detail. Clara picked up the sharpened pencil and used it to write a single digit on her paper ledger sheet, noting the registration of a certificate from 1998. The future of Vanguard is your responsibility, Julian, she said softly. You are the chief executive. You have an operations administrator and a legal team. I am simply a registry clerk. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Clara could hear the distant sound of rain hitting the street outside the bank's glass doors, and the frantic tapping of Julian's fingers against his phone casing. "You're doing this on purpose," he whispered, his voice suddenly sounding cold, small, and frightened. "I don't know what you're doing, Clara, but this isn't about your job." "I have to finish my filing now," Clara said. "The auditor is waiting." She hung up the receiver. She did not slam it down. She set it gently back onto its cradle until the dial tone clicked off. She pulled her tablet from her purse and opened the server console. The clock on her desk read 11:59 a.m. She watched the screen. In the center of the dark blue dashboard, the green status bar for the Vanguard production cluster began to flicker. At 12 o'clock, the clock on the wall let out its dull, mechanical chime. On the tablet screen, the green bar turned yellow, then faded to a cold, solid gray. A small red banner appeared at the top of the interface. Subscription suspended. Write access revoked. Database transitioning to read-only mode. Clara watched the gray bar for a few seconds. She felt nothing but the slight coolness of the basement air against her face. She closed the browser, put the tablet away, and picked up the next manila folder from her stack. The silent phase of her preparation was complete. The structure was now officially leaning, and the first major support beam had just fractured under its own unmonitored weight. The basement office was quiet at 2:15 p.m. Most of the registry staff had finished their afternoon tea, leaving only the low, continuous rattle of the building's old ventilation system to break the silence. Clara sat at her desk, her movements small and deliberate. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a small wooden cutting board, no larger than a paperback book, and a green Granny Smith apple. From her purse, she retrieved a small folding pocket knife with a worn bone handle. She pressed the brass release button, the blade clicking into place with a sharp metallic sound. With slow, steady strokes, she began to slice the apple. The sharp, tart scent of the green skin immediately filled the small space around her desk, cutting through the heavy smell of dust and old paper. She cut the apple into paper-thin wedges, arranging them in a perfect overlapping circle on a small white plastic plate. She took one slice, placed it in her mouth, and chewed slowly, her eyes fixed on the green vinyl blotter of her desk. She reached for her tablet, unlocking the screen. As root administrator, her personal email was still configured to receive the automated critical system logs from Vanguard's primary server cluster. The screen was filled with a cascade of automated warnings, all time-stamped between 2 o'clock and 2:15 p.m. Critical error. Diagnostic test failed, the logs read. Underwriter Sandbox IP 198.51.100.12. Query type, write replication. Status, fail. Reason, database in read-only mode. Clara took another slice of apple. The diagnostic test from L&M Partners had run exactly on schedule at 2 o'clock. The underwriter's automated testing script had attempted to create a dummy account, write a simulated transaction to the ledger, and verify the live sync. Because the database had transitioned to read-only mode at noon, the script had been blocked. The system logs showed that the diagnostic had retried 47 times before finally throwing a critical timeout error and halting the process entirely. Directly below the server logs was an automated system alert from Vanguard's internal code repository. Unauthorized access attempt. Code rollback denied, the alert read. User v.chin@vanguardledger.com. Action: Master API branch override. Reason: insufficient privileges. Root administrator authorization required. Vivian had attempted to use her administrative profile to roll back the security keys Clara had rotated this morning, trying to force the system to accept the old, expired credentials. But Clara had already modified the repository security groups during her lunch break yesterday, reducing Vivian's profile from co-administrator to standard developer. To the system, Vivian was now just an employee trying to alter core infrastructure without authorization. Clara's mind calculated the financial waste. Julian's engineering team consisted of 14 senior software developers, each earning an average of $95 an hour. Because the main repository was locked and the production database was in read-only mode, none of them could write new code, test existing features, or deploy patches. They were currently sitting at their mahogany desks downtown, drinking high-end coffee and drawing a combined salary of $1,330 an hour to do absolutely nothing. But that was a minor detail compared to the L&M underwriting agreement. The failure of the diagnostic test meant the valuation audit was officially suspended. By tomorrow morning, the news would begin to circulate among the secondary venture partners, raising the first serious questions about Vanguard's technical viability. Her email notification light blinked. It was a message from Eleanor Finch's legal assistant. "Dear Mrs. Vance," the message read, "we have finalized the draft of the verified complaint for patent infringement and breach of contract, along with a motion for an emergency temporary restraining order. Please find the documents attached for your signature." Clara clicked on the attachment. She scrolled through the 54 pages of dry, clinical legal prose. It was written in a cold, precise dialect of Latin phrases and statutory references, but the structure was simple and devastating. It detailed how Vanguard Ledger, Inc. had knowingly used the proprietary data compression algorithm owned exclusively by Vanguard Assets, LLC, without a valid license since the date of their public offering. It requested an immediate federal injunction to halt all operational use of the algorithm, which would effectively force Vanguard Ledger, Inc. to shut down its platform entirely. Clara opened the digital signature portal. She positioned the cursor over the yellow box marked Plaintiff Signature. With a single firm tap of her finger, she applied her cryptographic signature to the document. The portal displayed a green checkmark. Document signed and locked. Eleanor Finch's team would receive the signed file instantly, allowing them to file the lawsuit at the federal courthouse when the clerk's office opened at 8:30 tomorrow morning. Clara closed the tablet, slipped the pocket knife back into her purse, and took the last slice of green apple from her plate. She wiped the blade of the knife with a paper towel, folded it closed, and returned the small wooden cutting board to her drawer. The wall clock read 2:30 p.m. The rain outside the high basement window had stopped, leaving the asphalt of the light well wet and black, reflecting the cold gray sky above. The silence in the basement was deep and absolute, a quiet space where the air was still and the ground did not shake, even as the structure downtown began to slide toward the edge. The clock on the basement wall read 5:45 p.m. In 15 minutes, the municipal health registry would close for the evening. Clara stood by her desk, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached into the wastepaper bin next to the copy machine and retrieved 2 sheets of yesterday's local newspaper, the dry, ink-stained sheets rustling softly in her hands. She laid them flat on her green vinyl blotter. She picked up her ceramic tea mug, the one with the small blue floral pattern that she had brought from home 10 years ago on her very first day. She set the mug in the center of the newsprint, folded the corners of the paper over the rim, and wrapped it securely, tucking the loose edges underneath to create a thick, protective layer. She unlocked her bottom desk drawer with a small brass key. From the dark interior, she retrieved her personal items: a spare pair of reading glasses in a worn leather case, a small tube of unscented hand cream, and her private notebook with the black fabric cover. She placed these items inside a small, flat cardboard box she had kept stored behind the filing cabinets. Once the drawer was empty, she took a clean microfiber cloth, dampened it slightly under the break room tap, and wiped down the green vinyl blotter. She cleaned the surface with long, even strokes, removing the thin layer of dust and the faint grease ring where her coffee mug had sat for years. When she was finished, the desk looked completely vacant, as if the position had been retired. Her phone, resting on the clean blotter, began to vibrate. The screen illuminated with Julian's name. It was the 15th missed call since 3 o'clock. Clara did not answer. She watched the screen shake against the vinyl surface until the vibration stopped, leaving the room silent once more. A moment later, a long text message from Julian appeared on the screen. "Clara, where are you?" the message read. "The tech team has been on the phone with AWS support for 3 hours. They are saying the administrative lock is tied directly to the root email address, and they won't release the system state without a physical verification from the account creator. L&M has officially suspended the diagnostic review. They think we have been hacked. Vivian is saying this is too specific to be a standard database glitch. She says someone must have altered the administrative security groups manually from the root console. Did you do something to the system, Clara? Answer me. I am leaving the office now. I am coming home. We need to talk." Clara read the message. Her expression remained perfectly smooth, her breathing regular and quiet. Her mind began a quiet, cold calculation. Julian was leaving his office. In traffic, the drive to their house would take him approximately 35 minutes. She would leave the registry in 5 minutes, and her drive would take 35 minutes as well. They would arrive at the house at almost the exact same moment. He was transitioning from confusion to suspicion, but he still did not understand the true scale of the legal mechanism that had been set in motion. He believed she had simply altered the server settings out of a domestic grudge, an act of petty defiance that could be resolved with an argument, a patronizing explanation, or a demand. He had no idea that in less than 15 hours, a federal marshal would deliver a temporary restraining order to his corporate offices, halting his entire platform. He believed the conflict was about his behavior at the launch party. He did not understand that she had already moved past the emotional stage of the betrayal. She was no longer calculating his guilt. She was calculating the asset recovery. The $45 million of paper valuation he held was a phantom, a number on a digital ticker that could vanish in a single trading session. But the patent for the data compression algorithm was real. By reclaiming the patent through the holding company, she would own the only piece of technology that made Vanguard functional. She could license it to their competitors, sell it to a larger conglomerate, or simply let it sit in her drawer, completely inactive. Martha, the receptionist, walked past the open door of the archive room, her coat already zipped to her chin. "Have a good night, Clara," Martha said, waving a gloved hand. "See you tomorrow." "Good night, Martha," Clara said. She picked up the small cardboard box containing her personal mug and belongings. She tucked her leather purse under her arm, turned off her desk lamp, and walked out of the room. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut, the latch clicking into place with a dry metallic sound that echoed down the empty corridor. She walked out of the building's main entrance. The rain had returned, a cold, steady drizzle that turned the evening air thick and gray. She walked down the concrete steps, her flat shoes making a soft, wet splashing sound on the sidewalk. She placed her cardboard box in the trunk of her sedan next to the spare tire. She got behind the wheel, started the engine, and turned on the heater. The fan let out a dry, dusty squeak before blowing a stream of warm air onto her cold hands. She backed the car out of the parking space and turned onto the main road. The red tail lights of the cars ahead of her stretched out into a long, shimmering line through the wet windshield. The preparation phase was finished. The legal documents were locked in the federal filing queue. The system servers were frozen. The joint funds were split. She drove toward the residential district, her mind completely still, preparing for the final direct confrontation in their quiet house before the legal trap snapped shut in the morning. The hum of the baseboard heater under the kitchen window was a dry, buzzing vibration that blew a steady stream of hot air against Clara's ankles. In the narrow hallway, the damp smell of Julian's wet wool coat, draped carelessly over the banister, rose to meet her. Clara stood by the entryway closet, hanging her charcoal coat on the middle peg. She bent down, slipped off her wet flat shoes, and lined them up neatly on the rubber mat. Then she walked into the kitchen, her movements calm, slow, and unhurried. She turned on the cold water tap, picked up a clean glass from the drying rack, and filled it. The water had a faint, sharp scent of municipal chlorine. She stood by the sink and took a long, slow sip, feeling the coldness travel down her throat, grounding her in the physical reality of the quiet kitchen. Julian was standing on the other side of the kitchen island. He had not showered. The dark blue button-down shirt he had worn to the office yesterday was wrinkled and damp with sweat under the arms, and his hands were trembling slightly as he held his silver laptop. The moment Clara set her glass down on the counter, Julian slammed his laptop lid shut against the island's hardwood surface. The sharp plastic smack echoed through the quiet house like a pistol shot. "You changed the master credentials," Julian said. His voice was not loud, but it was thin, dry, and practically vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy. The AWS support team verified it. They said a manual administrative key rotation was executed at 5:15 yesterday morning from a device registered to your personal developer profile. Why did you do it, Clara? Why are you trying to ruin this? Clara picked up her water glass, took another small sip, and set it down precisely in the center of a circular tile pattern on the counter. The security groups needed to be updated before the public offering, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, level, and entirely devoid of defensive modulation. Your operations administrator, Vivian, had been granted too many unmonitored privileges on the root repository. I simply corrected the access levels to match the original holding company agreement. Vivian? Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh, stepping closer to the island, his face pale and tight under the fluorescent range hood light. This is about Vivian? Clara, she is the operations manager. She needs those privileges to coordinate the deployment pipeline. Because of your petty power play, L&M has officially suspended the diagnostic review. They think we have been hacked. They think the entire database architecture is unstable. You have put $80 million of valuation in jeopardy because you are jealous of my assistant. Clara looked at him. She noted the small red blood vessel that had popped in the corner of his left eye, the dry white crust of dried saliva at the corner of his mouth, and the slight, frantic twitch of his collarbone. He was attempting to reduce a massive structural and financial default down to a cartoonish domestic spat, a scenario where he was the rational, hard-working victim of an emotional wife's grudge. Clara's mind calculated the energy required to correct his premise versus the energy required to let him speak. She chose silence. She did not argue about Vivian. She did not defend her actions. She simply stood by the sink, her hands resting lightly on the cool edge of the laminate counter. Julian stared at her, his breathing loud and shallow in the quiet room. When she did not reply, his eyes darted toward her leather purse, which was resting on the kitchen table near her car keys. "Give me the root login," he said, his tone shifting from anger to a cold, demanding authority. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard. I built the technology. I built the client base. You were just the accountant, Clara. You have no right to touch my code. Open your tablet and restore the master API keys right now." "I cannot do that," Clara said softly. Julian let out a sharp, ragged breath. He crossed the kitchen, reached down, and grabbed her leather purse from the table. "What are you doing, Julian?" Clara asked. She did not move toward him. She did not raise her voice. "I am getting the tablet," he muttered, his fingers clawing at the brass zipper of her bag. He pulled the zipper open with a rough, tearing sound. He reached inside, his hand brushing past her wallet and her personal ledger book, before his fingers caught the edge of the thick manila folder Eleanor Finch had prepared for her. He pulled the folder out, expecting to find the tablet. When his eyes fell on the printed legal documents, he paused, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" he asked. He opened the folder, his thumbs leaving dry, gray smudge marks on the high-quality linen bond paper. He began to flip through the pages, his eyes scanning the bolded headings. Verified complaint for patent infringement. Emergency motion for temporary restraining order. Declaratory judgment of license revocation. His face changed. The flushed, angry color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a dull, chalky white. He looked at Clara, then back at the legal document, his eyes widening as he read her signature on the final page, verified by a digital notary seal. "Vanguard Assets, LLC?" Julian whispered, his voice suddenly sounding small, hollow, and entirely lost. "You are suing me? You are filing an injunction to freeze the database?" "The holding company owns the patents, Julian," Clara said. Her voice was as calm and clinical as if she were reading a birth certificate registration number. "The operating subsidiary, Vanguard Ledger Inc., has been using the database compression algorithm under a revocable license that expired the moment you transitioned the company to a publicly traded entity without renegotiating the royalty terms. You have been in default since 9 a.m. yesterday." Julian's fingers tightened on the paper, wrinkling the edge of the verified complaint. His face twisted into an expression of raw, predatory fury, the polite executive mask vanishing entirely. "You're trying to steal my company," he hissed, his body shaking. "You think you can use some old paperwork to lock me out of the platform I coded? I will have the corporate legal team file a fraud suit against you by tomorrow morning. I will have you stripped of every share you hold. You won't get a single dime of this. The corporate legal team represents the operating subsidiary, Julian," Clara said. "They do not represent you personally. And under the corporate charter of Vanguard Assets, LLC, I hold 100% of the voting interest. The lawsuit has already been filed in the Federal District Court queue. The process server will deliver the injunction to your downtown offices at 9 a.m. tomorrow." Julian looked down at the paper, then back at Clara, realizing for the first time the absolute finality of the legal framework she had built around him. His paper millions, his penthouse celebration, his new executive assistant, they were all resting on a foundation of code that he did not legally own, code that she had just reclaimed with a single, quiet signature. He stood in the center of the kitchen, his hands holding the wrinkled pages of his own destruction, the silence between them heavy, cold, and absolute as the rain began to beat a steady, drumming rhythm against the dark window pane behind them. The living room was dark, save for the pale, cold yellow sliver of light that stretched out from beneath the closed office door, splitting the old pine floorboards of the hallway. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, heavy downpour, the water gurgling loudly down the metal downspout near the chimney. A low, distant rumble of thunder rolled over the neighborhood, vibrating the glass panes of the front window. Clara sat in her grandmother's old floral-patterned armchair near the cold fireplace. She did not turn on the lamp next to her. She sat in the dim gray shadows, her hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug of chamomile tea. She stirred the liquid in slow, concentric circles, the metal spoon making a soft, rhythmic clinking sound against the ceramic. She took a small sip, letting the warmth settle in her chest, completely still. Through the thin drywall of the hallway, Julian's voice was a muffled, frantic staccato. He had been in his office for over an hour, pacing the floorboards with a heavy, uneven tread that made the ceiling joists above her head creak. "No, she has the original folders, Alan," Julian was saying, his voice rising in pitch before being choked back down into a harsh whisper. "Yes, Vanguard Assets, LLC, the operating agreement from 2018. No, we never amended the registry. Alan, you were our corporate counsel during the Series A round. Why didn't your team catch this? We were in a rush to clear the audit. You said we could clean up the holding company structure post-IPO. Well, the post-IPO is now. A long pause followed, filled only with the sound of the rain beating against the siding of the house. What do you mean, a civil contract dispute? Julian's voice cracked, a raw, desperate edge breaking through the muffled drywall. Alan, I went public yesterday morning. The stock is subject to a 6-month lockup. If she files a restraining order and halts the database replication, the enterprise clients will drop us by Friday. The stock price will crash before I can liquidate a single share to pay her off. I'll be bankrupt before the lockup expires. I need a countersuit. File for conversion. File for theft of credentials. File for anything. Another silence. Clara took another sip of her tea. Her mind ran through the quiet, cold calculations. Julian's personal attorney, Alan, charged $650 an hour for emergency consultations. By midnight, Julian would have spent nearly $3,000 of his dwindling cash reserve to be told the exact same truth, that a written, notarized corporate charter holding 100% of the intellectual property could not be set aside by a claim of implied partnership in an emergency hearing. The court did not care about his ambition or his paper millions. The court cared about the signatures on the deeds. Even if Julian's team attempted to rewrite the database compression algorithm to bypass her patent, it would require a team of senior engineers, at least 8 months of intensive development to replace her proprietary module. And they would have to do it while their servers were locked down under a federal injunction, unable to serve their active clients. The office door clicked open, the pale yellow light spilling across the hallway and into the dark living room. Julian stepped out. He was clutching his laptop against his chest like a shield, his shirt collar completely open, his face haggard and wet with sweat. He stopped in the hallway, his eyes searching the darkness of the living room until they settled on Clara, sitting in the armchair. He walked over to the edge of the room, standing in the shadow of the bookcase. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion, confusion, and a lingering defensive anger. "Alan says we can settle this, Clara," Julian said. His voice was flat, trying to sound controlled, but his shoulder was twitching rhythmically. "He says we can draft an amendment to the holding company agreement. We can offer you a 15% direct equity stake in Vanguard Ledger, Inc., exempt from the lockup period, if you withdraw the filings tonight. You can have $6 million in liquid cash by tomorrow morning. You won't have to work at the registry anymore. You can have whatever you want." Clara did not look up from her tea. She watched the steam rise from the mug, disappearing into the dark space of the room. "The files have already been processed by the federal court clerk, Julian," Clara said. Her voice was smooth, quiet, and entirely devoid of malice. "The motion is in the system. I cannot withdraw it." $6 million, Clara! Julian stepped closer, his voice rising, his fingers tightening on his laptop until the plastic casing groaned. "You are destroying everything over a bureaucratic grudge. You want to ruin my life because of a launch party? Because I introduced Vivian as the brains behind the pivot? It was marketing. The investors wanted a young, aggressive team. I had to project a certain image for the valuation. It wasn't personal." "The corporate structure was created 6 years ago, Julian," Clara said, "long before Vivian was hired. You chose to keep the intellectual property in my name to protect it from your personal creditors. You accepted the benefits of that protection for 6 years. Now you must accept the terms of the default." Julian stared at her, his face twisting into a mask of silent, impotent rage. He realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that she was not angry. She was not seeking an apology. She was not looking for a validation of her pain, and she was not trying to negotiate. She was simply executing a contract that he had signed and forgotten. "You are going to end up with nothing," Julian hissed, his voice dropping into a low, desperate threat. "I will tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years. I will make sure every dime of your settlement goes to legal fees. I will ruin you, Clara." Clara stood up. She set her empty ceramic mug down on the side table, the wood making a soft, dry click in the quiet room. She picked up her cardigan, wrapping it tightly around herself against the draft from the hallway. "I have already paid my retainer, Julian," she said softly. "The law firm of Albright and Finch has 60 partners. They are very efficient." She walked past him, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. She did not look at his face. She walked down the hallway, entered the main bedroom, and closed the door behind her. She turned the brass lock, the bolt sliding into the frame with a solid, final click. She lay down on her side of the bed, pulled the quilt over her shoulders, and listened to the rain drumming against the roof, her mind completely quiet as the midnight deadline approached. The pale, watery yellow light of a rain-washed Thursday dawn filtered through the horizontal blinds, casting thin gray stripes across the empty bed. Clara sat on the edge of the mattress, her movements quiet and deliberate. She pulled her dark gray stockings up, aligning the seams along her calves, then slid her feet into her black leather flats. She stood up and walked to the dresser. Her physical routine was grounding. She picked up her silver wristwatch, wrapping the cold metal mesh band around her left wrist. The clasp locked into place with a sharp metallic click that sounded incredibly loud in the absolute quiet of the house. The clock on her nightstand read 7:12 a.m. Julian's car was already gone from the driveway. He had left before 6 a.m., likely heading straight to the downtown headquarters to meet with his corporate lawyers and Vivian. He was running on pure adrenaline and desperation, trying to construct a technical or legal defensive line against an administrative wall that had already been built. Clara walked to the kitchen, poured a single glass of cold tap water, and drank it slowly. She did not make coffee. She did not want the noise of the grinder or the smell of hot grinds to interrupt the cold clarity of her morning. She walked out of the house at 7:45 a.m. The air was crisp, smelling of damp pine needles and wet asphalt. She drove her sedan through the light morning traffic, arriving at the Municipal Health Department building exactly 15 minutes before her shift was scheduled to begin. She descended the concrete steps into the basement archive room. The fluorescent lights flickered twice before settling into their dull, buzzing hum. She sat at her desk, pulled her tablet from her purse, and placed it on the green vinyl blotter. At exactly 8:31 a.m., the tablet screen lit up. A notification from the federal court's electronic filing system appeared, followed immediately by an encrypted email from Eleanor Finch's legal assistant. Clara opened the attached document. In the upper right corner was a fresh, wet ink stamp from the Clerk of the United States District Court. Case number CV-2026 1-04891-TRO, the document read. Vanguard Assets, LLC, Plaintiff, versus Vanguard Ledger Incorporated, Julian Vance and Vivian Chen, Defendants. Order granting emergency temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction. The federal judge had signed the order at 8:15 a.m., finding that the plaintiff had demonstrated a high likelihood of success on the merits of the patent infringement claim, and that immediate irreparable harm would occur to the intellectual property of the holding company if the operating subsidiary continued to use the database compression algorithm. The injunction was active. Clara's mind calculated the minute-by-minute timeline of the morning. The stock market was scheduled to open at 9:30 a.m. The process server hired by Albright and Finch was currently standing in the lobby of Vanguard's downtown high-rise, holding 3 physical certified copies of the restraining order. At exactly 9 o'clock a.m., the server would walk into the executive suite, bypass the receptionist, and hand the documents directly to Julian, to Vivian, and to the registered corporate agent of Vanguard Ledger, Inc. At the exact same moment, a digital copy of the injunction would be automatically delivered to the compliance division of the stock exchange and to the legal team of the lead underwriters at L&M Partners. Under federal securities regulations, a publicly traded company that is served with an active injunction halting the use of its core technology must immediately notify the exchange. The exchange's risk management software would flag the stock VGLD and halt all trading before the opening bell could ring. Julian's $42 million of paper wealth would be locked behind a gray, frozen ticker symbol, completely unreachable. The clock on the archive wall read 9 o'clock a.m. Clara clicked on the server monitoring dashboard on her tablet. The screen, which had been quiet for the last 9 hours, suddenly began to flicker with a massive spike in internal administrative alerts. The system logs showed that the database architecture was receiving an enormous volume of forced shutdown commands. The engineering team downtown was frantically trying to isolate the compression module to comply with the federal court's order. But because they did not have write access to the master repository, their changes could not be deployed to the production environment. At 9:05 a.m., an automated system email arrived in Clara's inbox, CC'd to the primary administrative address she still controlled. To all board members and executive officers, the subject line read, Emergency Board of Directors meeting called. Time, 9:30 a.m. Location, Main Conference Room, Vanguard Headquarters. Agenda, response to federal court injunction and halt of public trading. The email was signed by Julian Vance, Chief Executive Officer. Directly below that email, another notification appeared from her personal credit union app. The transfer of her $12,155 had successfully cleared the final banking reconciliation queue. Her private savings account was fully funded, secure, and entirely isolated from any corporate or personal liabilities Julian might face in the coming weeks. Clara closed the server console. She shut down her tablet, slid it into her leather purse, and zipped the pocket closed. She stood up and walked to the row of olive green steel filing cabinets. She pulled drawer number 9 open, the heavy metal rollers making a sharp, screaming screech that echoed through the quiet basement. She retrieved a fresh stack of birth certificates from 1999. The paper was clean, smooth, and dry, smelling of faint wood pulp and ink. She sat back down at her desk, picked up her newly sharpened pencil, and began her morning filing. Her movements were steady, her mind completely quiet, as the clock on the wall ticked toward 9:30 a.m., the exact moment the market would open to a frozen ticker symbol and a company that had officially run out of air. The basement archive room was cool and quiet at 12:15 p.m., the rain having finally ceased, leaving only a damp, clean breeze to draft through the high, narrow window at the top of the wall. Clara sat at her desk, the fluorescent lights humming their steady, familiar, low-frequency note above her. She opened her plastic lunch container, which held a single hard-boiled egg and 3 plain, dry crackers. Her physical routine was slow, deliberate, and grounding. She tapped the egg twice against the rim of her small metal trash bin, creating a web of tiny fractures across the white shell. With her fingernails, she began to peel the shell away, focusing on removing the thin, papery membrane beneath the calcium layer without tearing the smooth white albumin underneath. She worked in silence, letting the small white flakes fall into the bin one by one until the egg sat perfectly smooth on her small white plate. The sharp, slightly sulfurous scent of the egg rose into the quiet air, followed by the dry, paper-thin rustle of the cracker sleeve as she opened it. Her personal mobile phone, resting next to her plate, began to ring. The screen displayed a number Clara did not recognize, but the area code was local, and the prefix matched the corporate trunk line of the Vanguard downtown offices. Clara did not answer immediately. She took a small bite of a cracker, chewing slowly, letting the dry crunch settle in her ears. On the 4th ring, she reached out, pressed the green button, and held the phone to her ear. "Clara, are you there?" The voice was Vivian's, but it was entirely stripped of the smooth, executive confidence she had projected at the launch party, or the polite, hurried arrogance she had shown behind the registry's glass partition yesterday. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, and her voice trembled with a raw, thin panic. In the background, Clara could hear a chaotic clamor, doors slamming, distant raised voices, and the high-pitched beep of an office security alarm that had not been deactivated. "Yes," Clara said. Her voice was quiet and level, completely lacking any emotional modulation. "Clara, we need to talk," Vivian said, her words coming in a frantic, uncoordinated rush. "The board of directors has been in the conference room with the underwriters since 9:30. They are accusing Julian of gross negligence and fraud. The lawyers from L&M are saying that because my name is on the repository access logs for the database rollback attempt yesterday, I could be held personally liable for patent infringement. I am 25 years old, Clara. My career is over if my name remains on a federal lawsuit. I was just doing what Julian told me to do. He told me the holding company agreement was a formality that you had already agreed to resolve." Clara took a small bite of her hard-boiled egg. She chewed, swallowed, and set the egg back on her plate. "You should discuss those details with your personal legal representative, Vivian," Clara said. Her tone was as calm and clinical as if she were explaining a filing delay to a registry client. I have delegated all administrative and litigation decisions to Eleanor Finch of Albright and Finch. My personal involvement is limited to the verification of the initial corporate documents." "But Clara, please," Vivian gasped, her voice breaking, the sound of her crying muffled by the microphone. "Julian is in his office. He's completely broken. He locked the door and won't speak to the board or the L&M partners. The underwriters have officially withdrawn their SEC filing. The company's trading halt is permanent unless we can present a signed licensing agreement by 5 o'clock today." "I will sign whatever you want, Clara. I'll testify that Julian knew about the default terms. I'll testify that he deliberately ignored the registry warnings to secure the funding. Just tell your lawyer to remove my name from the patent suit." Clara looked at her paper ledger on the desk, noting the column of birth registrations from 1999. Her mind processed Vivian's offer with a cold, systematic precision. Vivian's willingness to turn on Julian was valuable, but mathematically unnecessary. The written operating agreement, the unpaid tax filings, and the digital logs of Julian's unauthorized access attempts were more than enough to secure a permanent injunction in federal court. By naming Vivian personally in the initial filing, Clara had achieved her secondary objective. She had severed Julian's support system, causing his executive assistant to immediately prioritize her own survival over his defense. Julian's platform was now completely isolated. "I have to return to my shift now, Vivian," Clara said softly. "My lunch period has concluded." "Clara, wait, please, you can't." Clara pressed the red end call button. She did not slam the phone down. She set it gently on the desk, screen down, its black glass surface reflecting the dull gray glare of the fluorescent lights. She took another bite of her egg, savoring the cool, simple saltiness of the yolk. Her internal calculation of Vanguard Ledger's remaining options was brief. Without the live sync technology owned by her holding company, the operating entity's intellectual property was valued at 0. The board of directors would have no choice but to terminate Julian's contract by the end of the day in an attempt to salvage their personal investments through a settlement with Clara. Julian would be stripped of his title, his corporate salary, and his remaining equity would be entirely consumed by the upcoming shareholder class action lawsuits. He would be returned to the exact financial state he was in 8 years ago, sitting in a dark room with a stack of unpaid bills and a system he could not run. Clara finished her lunch, packed the empty plastic container back into her insulated bag, and wiped her fingers clean with a paper towel. She stood up, walked to the filing cabinets, and pulled open the next drawer, the heavy rollers making their familiar screaming metallic screech. She retrieved the next stack of records, her hands steady, her breathing even, completely undisturbed by the collapse of the $90 million empire that was currently unfolding 6 blocks away. The evening was unusually clear. The heavy storm that had beaten against the kitchen window for 48 hours had finally blown eastward, leaving the sky over the quiet neighborhood a deep, pale violet. Clara parked her silver sedan in the narrow driveway. She did not rush. She turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and stood for a moment in the cool, damp air. The scent of wet pine needles, damp earth, and ozone was thick and sweet. She unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway. The silence of the house was no longer heavy or suffocating. It felt wide, light and clean, like an empty gallery waiting for a new exhibition. Julian's clothes, his laptop, and his leather briefcase were gone. He had returned to the house while she was at work, packed his belongings into 3 cardboard boxes, and left his physical house keys sitting in a neat metallic pile on the entryway table. There was no note. There was no need for one. At 5:15 p.m., as she was logging out of her station at the Municipal Health Registry, Clara had received the final encrypted email from Eleanor Finch. The board of directors of Vanguard Ledger, Inc. had executed a complete and unconditional surrender. To save the company from a permanent trading halt and total financial collapse, the board had voted unanimously to terminate Julian Vance from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. They had also terminated Vivian Chen's operational contract. In the same resolution, the board had authorized an emergency settlement with Clara Vance as the sole managing member of Vanguard Assets, LLC. The terms of the settlement were simple and absolute. Vanguard Ledger Incorporate would purchase the proprietary data compression algorithm patent from Clara's holding company for $12 million in cash, paid immediately upon the signing of the release. In addition, Clara would receive a permanent, non-dilutable 5% royalty on all future gross revenue of the operational platform. In exchange, Clara would withdraw the federal patent infringement lawsuit and restore the master API credentials to the cloud database console. Clara had signed the agreement. Her mind, operating with its usual quiet precision, did the final math. The $12 million in cash would clear her credit union account tomorrow morning. The 5% royalty would yield approximately $700,000 in passive income for her first year alone, a sum that would increase as the platform expanded. She would never have to work at the registry again. She would never have to balance 3 separate family budgets to cover a utility bill. Julian, meanwhile, was ruined. His $42 million of paper stock remained frozen under the exchange's regulatory halt. With his termination as CEO, the board had clawed back his unvested options. The remaining shares he held would likely be wiped out by the shareholder class action lawsuits already being prepared by the Series B underwriters for misrepresentation of intellectual property ownership. His personal bank accounts remained frozen under the bank's fraud hold. He had been stripped of his company, his wealth, and his reputation in a single, quiet morning. Vivian had already scrubbed her professional digital profiles and left the city, her career in the technology sector effectively dismantled by her personal inclusion in a federal patent lawsuit. Clara walked into the kitchen. She did not turn on the fluorescent range light. She walked straight to the glass sliding door that led to the small back garden, sliding it open to let the cool, fragrant evening air fill the room. She sat down on the wooden bench on the patio, holding a warm cup of herbal tea. For 10 years, she had worked 40 hours a week at a registry clerk's desk and another 30 hours at her kitchen table, quietly managing the infrastructure of a man who believed her presence was as natural and disposable as tap water. She had carried the debt, the liability, and the exhaustion, while he wore the tailored suits and drank the expensive champagne. She looked at her hands, resting quietly on her lap. They were no longer tight. The dull, familiar ache in her shoulders had vanished, replaced by a profound, sweeping sense of peace. Her invisible labor had not been lost. It had simply been measured, accounted for, and reclaimed. The setting sun dipped below the tree line, casting a warm, golden glow across her small, quiet garden. Clara took a slow, deep breath, smelling the fresh earth and the sweet, clean promise of a new beginning. She was 32 years old, she was entirely free, and the ledger of her life was finally, perfectly balanced. If this story reminded you that true love and quiet sacrifice should never be taken for granted, you are not alone. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voice in the room, it is the silent, steady builders who truly keep the structure from falling. What would you have done if you were in Clara's position? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away with the same quiet dignity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed deeply human stories of resilience, justice, family betrayal, and second chances, please consider subscribing to join our community. We share meaningful narratives that remind us that actions always have consequences, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried under pride and greed, will always find its way to the light.